Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I want to continue on with Dale's Bible study session. I mentioned I was excited. I was put in charge of my church's Bible study and apologetics program. Um, I wanted to do for my first week, I wanted to start. Look, we're in Easter time, so I wanted to look at the evidence proving that Jesus rose from the dead. I think that was an appropriate place to begin. Now, however, there are some updates that I have to make you aware of, some quite frankly disappointing news for me. So there's good and bad, right? So I've had at least 3 to 4 people who are a part of that, including a regular listener of this podcast, Brian, who's an unbeliever. And I just want to say thank you so much for being willing to show up for my Bible studies and stuff like that. That means a lot to me, and I know that you support the work in apologetics that I do. So that's great. I've had others saying that, my Bible study, this is my chance to try and teach on a popular level some of the most important Christian doctrines and why we believe they're true or what they mean and that sort of thing. Now, I have to respect the other side. There were at least as many people, if not more, mostly from within my church, who did not approve of my Bible study based on apologetics. They don't approve of apologetics in general. They number one, they thought it was too much over their head, despite my efforts to teach my best on a popular level. I thought I had done that. I sent it out to people who are lay people, and they said they understood it and that sort of thing. But I get that. So I've been making efforts to dumb it down even further as much as I possibly can, because obviously my goal is for you guys to understand. One thing that I didn't understand, though, and I've been told by my pastor, is that some of these people have been kind of complaining a little bit and saying that it wasn't just that it was over their head and stuff, but they're just not interested in apologetics at all. And they think, in fact, one of these people said they were offended because of their African culture. It's questioning the Bible, and the Bible's sacred. You can't even question it. You just have to believe it no matter what. And some objections because they think it contradicts the Bible, such as, oh well, doesn't Paul say this? All this philosophy stuff is it's vain philosophy, worldly philosophy, and you're not to engage in it. Or, we're supposed to believe the Bible is inerrant. Doesn't the Bible tell us that all the New Testament is inspired and God breathed? We have no right to question it or to demand evidence in this sort of thing. And obviously these are misinterpretations of these verses, as most of my listeners will know in the audience. No one with a PhD would interpret these verses that way, but that's fine. I mean, these guys don't know, right? They don't look into what the Bible actually means. They just kind of have this mistaken notion that, oh, philosophy, it's bad. That's superstition. We got to be away from that. So, that's on me. I kind of made a mistake as a teacher. I didn't know that the people going to my church were kind of this fightist, faith only, just blindly believe type mentality. And I should have been a better teacher. I should have start with, instead of starting to get into the evidence from the resurrection, I thought it would be appreciated. It's Easter time, stuff like that. I should have started from the beginning. I should have just started on, okay, what is apologetics? Why do we do apologetics? Why is it important? What is the biblical proof that demands and commands that every Christian engage in apologetics? It's not a choice. God tells you to do it. And this is in 1 Peter 3:15. That was on me. I should have done an entire 1 or 2 episodes starting with that. What is apologetics? Explaining why it's necessary for every Christian to engage in it and to appreciate it, and deal with their objections, because obviously, like I said, they also believe they're appealing to Bible verses. We can't just dismiss that as well. And I didn't even have a clue that it would be offensive to certain cultures and that sort of thing. And it's understandable, different culture. Like I didn't know the African culture found apologetics offensive. So I was grateful to my pastor for pointing that out because that didn't even occur to me. I would just kind of say, just who cares about your culture? I know that's a very brute way to say it. Obviously, I do care about you as a person, and if your culture is important, we're all brothers and sisters. We want to be respectful of each other, and as Paul does, respect each other's cultural differences. But why would I be so blunt? Because not at the expense of cultures. I'm sorry, we are Christians first. Your culture, irrelevant. My culture, irrelevant. We are Christians, and that is above man-made cultural norms. And we follow the Bible first. If we truly believe that, if we truly want to obey and honor God, we should follow the Bible, not our cultures. Obviously, this is kind of begging the question, in terms of my interpretation of the Bible verse. Well, who says that we're supposed to engage over this? Maybe one's culture's thing. I'm gonna get to do that kind of thing in about 2 months' time. I'm gonna start over this Bible study, doing it a little bit differently on my own thing. Obviously, my church has opted to shut down my apologetics program for the time being, until maybe people come around, or they can be kind of taught that apologetics isn't a scary thing. It isn't a bad thing. It's a necessary and good thing. And hopefully they'll come around in time and appreciate that. And I also think that they have a right to a traditional Bible study. I was never trying to take that away. We're doing that. You can see here, me and the pastor came up with a plan here that apparently that wasn't going to work either. But the point is, yeah, there should be traditional Bible studies, and there should be apologetics for those who want it. This shouldn't be something that's imposed on people, and stuff like that. I want to persuade them that apologetics is necessary and essential and important and also fun. I mean, it enriches your faith. Number one, I wouldn't be a Christian today if it wasn't for apologetics. We have unbelievers where apologetics is needed for them. Do we actually care about people saving people's souls, or do we just want to go and have a social club and sing songs and stuff like that every Sunday morning? No, we need to do more than that. It's all important, I believe. And we need to care about the salvation of people's souls. For that, you need apologetics. So that's sort of my take there. But yeah, I kind of took that for granted. I didn't realize that it would be objectionable to people, and because of that, I just kind of let's go right into the evidence for the resurrection. I should have started with what is apologetics and what is the justification, because some people apparently, even in my own church, have issues with demanding evidence or wanting evidence, or even just asking questions about the Bible is apparently it's not even just something they're not interested in, but it's actually offensive to them. And that's on me. I'm going to devote some shows to tackling that, some Bible studies to tackling that. But for right now, for this time, I did, before I heard about all these criticisms and stuff like that, I was already about 80% finished my Bible study that I'm going to do here. So this is just kind of continuing on with the evidence for the resurrection. I removed a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk. Originally, I wanted to prove Jesus died by crucifixion. He was buried in the tomb, and there was the empty tomb. I've knocked off the latter two things, and we're just going to focus on Jesus' death by crucifixion. I did that to simplify things there. Next month, because it's Easter, I do feel obligated to continue on, but not with the evidence for the resurrection, more a theological topic about the theories of the atonement. How does the atonement work? How did Jesus' blood on the cross and death on the cross actually atone for my sins? So I want to look at that in the beginning of April. And then after that, I'm going to start fresh with that what is apologetics and what's the value of apologetics and that sort of thing. So yeah, with that said, I'm just going to go ahead. This will be the last one. Obviously, we'll get to the evidence. Another, at some future point down the road, I will, if I continue on with these Bible study things on my own outside of Wexford, but inviting people from Wexford to join in on StreamYard, then we will return and finish off this series on the evidence for the resurrection. But I think it's going to build some time if I'm trying to persuade people at my church, if they're kind enough to give me another chance and to come on and participate. Okay, I'm gonna first persuade you about the basics, that apologetics is needed, that this stuff is important, rather than just jumping into the deep end of the pool. So yeah, that's my take there. Okay, so last time in our Bible study, we looked at faith versus reason and how it's sinful to just have blind faith. God rebukes those who just have a blind faith in any religion, even Christianity. No, faith in the Bible is a trust. It is an evidence-based trust. And there are different types of evidences. As I mentioned, the Holy Spirit provides us with testimonial evidence to our own spirits. This is a subjective evidence, but it's still evidence nonetheless. And I'll get into more details on that in some future Bible study again, if I'm doing that. And then I talked about 1 Peter 3:15, the utter commandment to every Christian alive to engage in apologetics, not an option. If you're a Christian, then you must have reasons for why you believe and for the hope that's in your heart. Then we also looked at the spiritual versus physical resurrection body and looked at a controversial text in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 35 to 44. And we proved conclusively with 4 reasons that the Christian view is the physical resurrection body view. And then we have Dale Allison's doubts. I talked about what happens to bodies that are totally obliterated. And finally, the fact that our resurrection bodies are not just the same, they are glorious resurrection bodies. Okay, so for today, our thing is solely focused on proving one fact, that Jesus died by crucifixion. Nice and simple. That's all we care about ultimately. However, there is a bit of background. One of the people from my church requested a little bit more background. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about one of the historical sources we use to establish the fact of Jesus' death by crucifixion. So let's get into that now, right? So in the first place, in terms of approach, there are multiple approaches, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm contrasting the maximal and minimal facts approach. So a lot of the people at my church would demand a maximal facts approach. And they would say, no, in order to prove the resurrection, we need to take everything in the Gospels, all the New Testament data as a given. This is just inerrant. We have no right to question it. We have to use all of it. It's wrong to compromise with an atheist or a skeptic or an unbeliever and try to, make deals with them as to which facts they will accept. You don't argue for the resurrection on their terms. You only argue for it on the full maximal facts of the Gospels. No compromises, nothing like that. Now, the more popular approach is the minimal facts approach in Christian apologetics. People like Gary Habermas, we're going to see in a second, who's a personal friend of mine and a mentor. Mike Lacone, also a friend and a mentor and stuff. And wasn't for these 2 men, I wouldn't be a saved Christian today. And also Tim and Lydia McGrew have also been very helpful with Lydia, especially after my conversion and stuff like that. So I don't want to take that away from them. They're helpful too. But they argue, look, we don't need to argue for every fact. That's just foolish. Why on earth would you argue with an atheist about gospel contradictions and get into meaningless stuff like that? They just don't want to believe. So what's the point? We can instead focus the discussion down to Jesus's resurrection, and specifically about 5 to 6 facts that even atheists, the most biased atheist in the entire world, would admit, yeah, those 5 to 6 things are historical facts. So if they are granting to you these historical facts, and you can prove the resurrection just on these 5 to 6 facts, why on earth would you want to get into some debate about meaningless gospel contradictions on secondary details? How many women went to the tomb? Which women went to the tomb? Was there a guard at the tomb? Only one gospel says so. These are all important questions, and questions that apologists should answer. But if we're trying to prove the claim that Jesus rose from the dead, they're ultimately unnecessary. We don't need to address these questions. We can just say, look, all that's great. We can debate that at a later time. But for the purposes of this discussion, proving that Jesus rose, we don't need to answer that stuff. We can prove that it happened just on the basis of what you've already granted me, Mr. Atheist. So yeah, this minimal facts approach is very strategic and very helpful in that it avoids unnecessary debate with atheists and skeptics and unbelievers. Now, these minimal facts basically there's 2 criteria. Number one, they are highly evidenced, and this is why atheists and skeptics in the know wouldn't deny them. And there's multiple lines of argumentation proving that they are historical facts. And secondly, they are accepted as facts by the vast majority of scholars. I think it's something like 95% or more, or something like that Gary goes for. And that's regardless of worldview, atheist, Muslim, Jew, Christian, they accept these things as facts. So this is a strength, right? So here's a quick video of Gary Habermas just kind of describing his minimal facts approach that he pioneered back in the day.
Bear the weight of our most cherished beliefs and so on.
For our listeners who may not already know, what is your apologetic methodology and the most affirmative case you can offer for the resurrection?
Okay, methodologically, the typical way evangelicals go after resurrection is to argue for the reliability of the Gospels. And as reliable books, they say thus and so. I use an approach I call the minimal facts method. And the minimal facts method I developed in my doctoral dissertation at a secular school. And my argument was, how far do we get toward resurrection if we use only the facts that critical scholars, non-Christians, think can be established? How do we get from death to resurrection? How do we get from resurrection to Christianity based on their data? So what I do is, instead of assuming the whole New Testament is reliable, I try to build from the ground up, and I picture a brick wall with every brick being an individual fact that we know about Jesus. One thing that's not very well understood is precisely this. Critics don't mind if you cite the New Testament. See, a lot of people stop you and they say, oh, you're just citing the New Testament. Listen, if you don't, the Bart Ehrmans of the world, the Don Crossans will cite the New Testament. Well, how do they cite it? They're only going to cite texts that they think can bear the weight of our latest knowledge. So I'm going to use the data which they allow, which they encourage other people to use. I'm going to use just that data, and my thesis is I'm going to use just the facts that have the following 2 characteristics. Number one, each brick or each fact I use has evidence coming in from different angles, so we have several reasons to believe this brick is true. Secondly, it just happens, this isn't as important, but it just happens that virtually all the critics who are writing also accept this fact. So since it's common ground between us, we can discuss it among ourselves. And if the result is resurrection, then I can ask the critic, what do you do with resurrection since your own facts have led you to this? So that's the method I use. I call the minimal facts argument, which...
Okay, so I think you guys get the point here, right? And obviously for you guys in the audience, you guys are well familiar with the minimal facts approach, but for those who may be new to it, or from those from my church, one of the concerns that I understand you guys have here in terms of approach, and it's a valid point. You might think, well, again, we are supposed to believe in biblical inerrancy, aren't we? And you'll point to verses like Second Timothy chapter 3, I believe it is. Again, I'll get to this in more detail, but in future shows. But sorry. It's important to note that if you do adopt a minimal facts approach, like Gary Habermas, my friend here, he's not denying biblical inerrancy. I mean, he teaches at one of the world's leading seminaries at Liberty University. He's the head of the philosophy program there. He's a hardcore evangelical, traditional, Bible believing Christian. He believes in biblical inerrancy. So the minimal facts approach is not contradictory with biblical inerrancy. It's not even contradictory with a maximal facts approach. It's not denying that everything the Gospels report is true. No, they believe it's true. They're just saying, but we don't need to argue those. It's not necessary to prove that Jesus rose from the dead. All that's necessary are these 5 to 6 facts that everyone agrees on are historical facts, and we can prove Jesus' resurrection. That nothing about that approach denies that other things in the Gospels are true, or that everything in the New Testament or the Bible as a whole is true. So biblical inerrancy is not contradictory with the minimal facts approach. We are not necessarily compromising with skeptics. So I just want to make that clear, because some of you guys, some of the people from my church did have that as an objection, from what I'm told, that they think somehow that if you adopt this minimal facts approach, well, that must mean that you're accepting the atheist position on some of the controversial things. No, we're not. I can stand boldly against them and say they are wrong about the guard of the tomb. They are wrong. There are no gospel contradictions and stuff like that. But I'm saying, just let's table that debate for the time being and focus on these facts that we both agree on, that common ground, and ask the question, well, can we prove Jesus rose from the dead or not? So that's all that's going there. I wanted to clarify that. Okay, so what's our text today in terms of the historical source? Oh, hang on. Stop sharing for a second. Okay, so our text here is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 11. And from an apologetic standpoint, I think this is the most important text in the entire Bible. The most apologetic value, because it provides evidence and proof that Jesus did rise from the dead via attesting to these the various facts, those 5 to 6 facts, right? So I'm just going to read it through in the first place. So, for I delivered to you as of first importance, this is Paul, the Apostle Paul speaking in his letter to 1 Corinthians, divine inspired revelation here. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that was with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed. So this is incredible. This is the Apostle Paul engaging in apologetics, giving the proof, the evidence that Jesus wasn't risen. He didn't say, just believe it because I said so. He said, no, you have the evidence that Jesus was dead, absolutely, buried and raised on the third day, and that he appeared to groups of people, many groups of people, and to various individuals, thereby providing the reason or the evidence, the apologia, the defense for why Christians believe what they believe. But just getting in, beyond that, getting into this source here, what's really important, look at this first line here. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. This is important because this is a specific Pharisaic formula from the first century Jews that this basically proves what Paul is saying here in what follows. These are Paul's words, right? So Paul wrote 1 Corinthians about 55 AD, so about 25 years after Jesus died. But what follows here in these verses does not come from Paul. He didn't just make it up. He received this. This is oral tradition that's pre-Pauline. It predates the Apostle Paul's letter here, and is official tradition from the apostles. It is a creed, just like we recite the Apostles' Creed in church today. Well, this is what the earliest Christians, the original Christians in the first century, right after Jesus' death, they invented this creed, and this is what they said. And Paul's just writing down that oral creed for us. And what's important here is because, why is this so important? It's because it gives us the entire gospel message about Jesus' death and resurrection. And this creed predates Paul right back to the beginning. It's most biblical scholars, again, whether atheist or not, will date this thing to within a few years of the resurrection, from 6 months, anywhere up to 5 years at the latest, after Jesus died and rose in 30 AD. So, this creed dates anywhere from 30 AD to 35 AD. They were orally saying what Paul says here. That's incredible. That is extremely early, and no other religion on the planet has anything similar to this kind of evidence and proof of what their original adherents were claiming. So yeah, I just have this little clip again of Dr. Gary Habermas. He's pro-Christian. He's not giving an atheist side. He's giving what Christians want to hear, but he's just explaining how important this 1 Corinthian creed is. So let me play that for you guys.
All right. This information that Paul actually preached and then wrote in 1 Corinthians 15, that first little section there, is what scholars call a creed.
Correct.
Okay? And that creed, Paul says, I got from somebody else. And the question is, who did he get it from? He could have gotten it from Peter and James at 5 years after the cross when he met with them in Jerusalem, or that creed could have come when he actually saw the risen Jesus at +2 from the cross. All right? And scholars want to know, when did this creed, this information, what is that information, by the way, that's in 1 Corinthians 15, and then tell us about how far back the scholars are saying this goes.
Well, we used in an earlier show, we used the words pre-Pauline. Here's the cross. Paul comes to Jesus. Now, pre-Pauline could be, in this case, anything up to the writing of 1 Corinthians, but technically the real heavy pre-Pauline stuff is right in here. It is this. When Paul comes to Jesus, if he would have stopped and said, stop the presses, I'm a Christian now, what do we already know about Jesus? That creed would have been there. That creed would have been in existence. That's pre-Pauline means Christ died for sins according to Scriptures, buried, rose again from the dead according to Scriptures, and appeared to Cephas, and then 2 individuals, 3 groups. Paul appends his name. Except for Paul appending his name, that list is there when Paul's converted.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
But I love the fact he appeared to 500 people at one time, all right?
Yeah.
And he appeared to the apostles, and 2 things. We want to talk about his meeting with Peter and James, but he meets with all of the apostles at 48. But sticking with this pre-Pauline thing is this answers the question, Christianity was not invented by Paul.
Okay, so you guys get the point here, right? Like, in terms of the dating of this oral creed, so it wasn't written down. Jesus died presumably 30 AD for the sake of argument. Let's not get into that debate. But Gary is saying this creed, so here at around 55 AD, if there was a marker here, that's when Paul writes his letter of 1 Corinthians. This creed that Paul is citing dates, it's pre-Pauline. It dates to before he became a believer, within 1 to 2 years of the death and resurrection. More skeptical scholars will place it as late as 35 AD, 5 years afterwards. But this is incredible evidence. It's extreme. It is the single earliest historical source, this oral creed, proving that Jesus died and rose from the dead. And from it, we can extract our historical data points. So that's the importance of this creed that I wanted to stress with you guys, is the fact that it's so early and it's authoritative. It comes from the Jerusalem apostles, because you mean Paul, an inspired apostle, received it from who? Well, obviously, when he went and interrogated James and Peter in Jerusalem when he first converted, he went to Jerusalem, and he uses the Greek word he did like investigative reporting. He investigated with rigor the actual eyewitnesses to see if what had been revealed to him was inconsistent, and to gain new details from them as to what they witnessed. And that is when majority of biblical scholars of all persuasions will say that's when he got this oral creed, when he visited Jerusalem and interrogated or investigated, as he would say, James or Peter and those guys. So that's where they get that dating from, if that makes sense. So, okay, what is the main thing? Look, we have this 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses, everything in white here, up to here kind of thing, is an oral creed that predates Paul. It was authoritative. He got it, this creed that was being passed down orally since the very beginning when Jesus died and rose. That's what you need to learn here. So I hope that's clear. Okay, great. So we have this creed. What are the historical facts we get from this creed, from the source? Like I said, there's only one that we care about today. That's the fact that Christ died for our sins by crucifixion in accordance with the scriptures. So, okay, well, how do we know what is crucifixion? What is this about? Basically, it was a Roman punishment used at the time of Jesus to punish the lower classes and rebel leaders and others. It was an extremely excruciating way to die, probably the most painful that they had at that time. And, think about it. It's where we get the word excruciating from, out of the cross, meaning extreme pain. What Jesus went through, just thinking about what he went through, the pain, it's incredible to think about that. So, yep. So moving on, crucifixion victims were usually beaten prior to being crucified. They were followed by jeering crowds. This all sounds familiar to what happened to Jesus in the Gospels. We have archaeological proof, at least 3. I've included the first from 1968 of Johannan, who dates to Jesus' time in the 1st century, and he's still got the nail embedded into his ankle bone. Incredible. Okay, so great. Now we know what crucifixion is and how Jesus is alleged to have died. How do we prove that it's a historical fact? And this is where I've listed about 7 of what historians call the criteria of authenticity, right? So when you're doing history, no matter what the source is, whether it's reliable or unreliable or not, historians aren't so foolish to just dismiss sources. No, they apply a certain set of criteria to those sources and texts and extract, okay, this little bit is historical. This is a fact, or this is probably a fact. This is probably a legend, stuff like that. And I've listed various criteria here, right? So criterion of multiple independent attestation, or other things, the criterion of disinterest and that sort of thing. I'm not going to get into all of these, but I want to focus on at least 4 of them for our purposes here today. So the first is the criterion of early eyewitness attestation. Well, if something's reported to very extremely early to the reported event, remember that 1 Corinthians oral creed dating within 1 to 5 years, very early, and it's reported by eyewitnesses, then it's probably true. So this is just the general criteria. Criterion of enemy or hostile attestation. Let's say your enemy says something that goes against his motivation or bias against you. That's probably true, right? So if your enemy says, oh, Jim Bob Jones here, he sucks, he's smelly, he's dumb, he's the worst human being I've ever met, but I have to admit, he always tells the truth. Well, if your enemy is saying that, well, then it's probably true that you are Jim Bob Jones is a very honest person because he'd be unlikely to lie to make his enemy look good. The criterion of embarrassment, this is when something is truly embarrassing for the person. It's unlikely to be made up. It's more likely that the person is just saying that because that's historically what happened. Whether it's embarrassing or not, they've got to be truthful. Finally, the criterion of dissimilarity. So this is something is probably true. A fact is probably true when it's dissimilar to the norm or how the established group says or does something normally. Okay, cool. So applying this to the fact of Jesus' death by crucifixion. Ooh, sorry, I'm tired today. Okay, so looking at reason number one, the criterion of early eyewitness attestation. Well, this is why we spent so much time looking at that First Corinthian creed and trying to help you understand where this source dates from and where it came from, because we fulfill the criterion of early and eyewitness attestation with this creed. It's extremely early, within months to a few years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and it comes from the eyewitnesses themselves, Peter, James, the other apostles in Jerusalem, as that's where Paul himself got it from. Reason number two, the criterion of embarrassment. Well, think about it. We're preaching the Messiah, Jesus, was crucified. Don't you remember Deuteronomy? You can't leave a body on a tree or a cross overnight. This if anyone is killed by being hung on a tree or a cross, this proves that God has cursed them. So this is equivalent. The early Christians said Jesus was the Messiah, yup, and Jesus was crucified, meaning so he was the Messiah, blessed by God, and at the same time he was cursed by God. This is very unlikely for someone to make up. The early Christians simply, it's too embarrassing. And really, the only way it makes sense is because they didn't want him to be crucified. They want him to be a conquering warrior and hero. That's how the Jews saw the Messiah's role back in this time in the first century. But they had this historical fact. They knew Jesus was the Messiah, but at the same time, they also knew he had been crucified. So they couldn't deny the truth. And obviously, as Christians today, we understand the Messiah's mission and two phases, two comings. So we have ways of explaining these facts. But the point remains that this is a fact that they couldn't deny, no matter how inconvenient for their theology. And because of that, they had to report it. Criterion of dissimilarity, the sign on the cross saying King of the Jews. This is a dissimilar title. No one in the early church really referred to Jesus by the title King of the Jews. They had other preferences. You look in the Gospels, look in the New Testament, it's not there. They prefer to call him the Lord or the Christ or the Son of God. They use other titles for Jesus, never King of the Jews. So this is probably historical. Finally, the criterion of enemy or hostile attestation. And I kind of cheated here. So, oh man, sorry guys. So there are various ancient sources that are hostile. So for example, the Jewish historian Josephus, who doesn't like Christians, he admits and talks about Jesus' death on the cross. He would know he was Jewish. He was one of the leaders. The Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, who had all the accounts of Pontius Pilate and the official records of the Roman Empire that had survived that day, to that day in the Roman libraries and records, he reports that Jesus died. So we have lots of multiple enemy sources attesting to the truth of Jesus' death by crucifixion. Not only that, modern scholars and atheists today, virtually all historians, it doesn't matter what worldview they have, they all agree Jesus died around 30 AD by crucifixion. Now, I have some examples here. So, for example, John Dominic Crossan, this guy is an atheist. He claims to be a Christian, but he's a fake. He doesn't believe that God truly exists as an eternal, necessary being, as the greatest of all conceivable beings and stuff like that. So he's not really a Christian at all. And he founded the Jesus Seminar, a very skeptical organization that Bible-believing Christians do not like at all. Even he admits, look, The fact that Jesus was crucified and killed on the cross is as sure as anything historical can ever be. This is incredible. And beyond that, I've got an atheist and agnostic scholar named Dr. Bart Ehrman, no friend of Christians. He's written 2 New York Times bestseller books ripping apart Christianity and the Bible and saying how you can't believe in it and all this stuff. Yet even he wouldn't be so foolish as to deny that it's a historically proven fact Jesus died on the cross. And finally, we have a very skeptical scholar from Yale named Dr. Dale Martin, who also confirms this. So let me just play their clips here, starting with Dr. Bart Ehrman, the atheist agnostic. And he's kind of going to be going over the argument from the criterion of embarrassment about a crucified Messiah. No one would make that up. It must be reported there because that's historically what happened. So let's hear him phrase that in his own words.
Would somebody make up a Messiah, specifically the Messiah, who was crucified? It's important to understand what Jews meant. Paul was a Jew. It's important to understand what Jews meant by the term Christ. In the days of Paul, there were some Jews who were expecting that a Messiah was going to come to the Jewish people sent from God. God would send a Messiah. The word Messiah actually comes from a Hebrew word, Mashiach, which means anointed one. Messiah is the same word as the Greek word Christ. The Hebrew word is Messiah, Greek word Christ. Jews had various expectations of what this Messiah would be, the anointed one. This is a term that was originally used in Jewish scriptures to refer to the king of Israel. He was the anointed one. When the king was anointed at his coronation ceremony, like King David, King Solomon, this showed that God was putting his favor upon him. In Jesus' day, there hadn't been a king on the throne for nearly 600 years. Some people thought there would be a king on the throne, and they called him the Anointed One, the Messiah. The Messiah was going to be a great warrior figure like David, a great warrior who drove out the enemy and set up God's kingdom by establishing a throne in Jerusalem, and Israel would once more be a sovereign state that would rule over its enemies. That's what the Messiah would do. Some Jews thought that the Messiah would be a cosmic figure who would destroy the forces of evil and set up God's kingdom on earth, a mighty cosmic judge. There were various expectations of what the Messiah would be, but there was one thing that all of the expectations had in common. Jews who expected a Messiah expected a great, powerful figure who would destroy the enemy and set up God's kingdom. And who was Jesus? The Christians said that Jesus was a crucified criminal. If you wanted to make up a story about the Messiah, would you make up the story that the Messiah had been crucified? That's the opposite of what the Messiah is supposed to be. If you want to make up a story about a Messiah, you'd make up the story that, well, he actually drove out the Romans and he is sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. Why didn't they make up that story? Because it obviously wasn't true. The early Christians were not going around saying that God had been crucified. They were saying that Christ had been crucified. Well, why did they do that? If it didn't make any sense to expect a crucified Messiah. It was because they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and they knew that he got crucified. You can't explain the crucified Messiah as something that was made up. The crucified Messiah is because people thought Jesus was the Messiah, and they knew that this man had been killed as a crucified criminal. That's why Paul says that the crucifixion of Jesus was the greatest stumbling block for Jews. It was the one reason most Jews rejected the Christian claim that Jesus was the Messiah. Most Jews thought the claim was crazy. That's the opposite of what the Messiah is supposed to be. If you want to make up a story...
Okay, so that's just kind of repeating there what he said. So let me move on to the next point by Dr. Dale Martin from Yale University. Again, he's a Christian, but he's very liberal and skeptical. even he admits it's ridiculous to deny that Jesus died on the cross as a fact of history. And he's appealing to that criterion of dissimilarity. Remember that title, the King of the Jews. So let's listen to him here about that for the next 3 minutes.
If you've got a parallel version, I'm going to be looking at Throckmorton because it has the synoptic parallels. It's Throckmorton, paragraph 249. But somebody put your finger on Mark 15:26. It's also Matthew 27:37. It's also Luke 23:38. And it's also John 19:19. Now in Mark 15:26 it says, the inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. That's it. Then it goes on about this stuff. Look over right next to it on Matthew. It says, over his head they put the charge against him and said, this is Jesus, the King of the Jews. So it's slightly different. Luke 23, what did I say? 38? There it is, There was also an inscription over him, this is the King of the Jews. And who has the John version? John 19:19. Did anybody put their finger on John 19:19? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And doesn't it say in John that it was in different languages? Or am I forgetting it? That's right, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek in the Gospel of John. So that's what we've got. One of the things that most scholars will say is, we think that's historical. And why do we think it's historical? Well, for one thing, it comes from at least two independent sources, right? What are the two independent sources that it comes from? It's in all four Gospels, but all four Gospels aren't independent sources, are they? Why? Because we believe that Matthew and Luke used Mark. So if Matthew and Luke copied it from Mark, that makes Mark one source. Did the author of John use the Gospel of Mark? Not according to the theory we're using in this class. Some people might say yes, some scholars might say yes, but in this class we're going on the theory that the Gospel of John probably didn't use Mark as one of his sources. So you've got the Gospel of John as one source for this. You've got the Gospel of Mark as another source for this. So you have two of what scholars are willing to treat as independent sources, which both have this nice little piece of data, this datum right there. Now the other thing is that, it might be interesting to for you to know, King of the Jews is not a Christological title that early Christians used about Jesus. Remember in the Gospels, we've seen a lot of different titles for Jesus. He's the teacher, he's the Son of God, he's the Messiah, he's the Holy One of Israel, we just saw. He has a lot of things, and these things are obviously things, early Christians called him Lord, they called him Son of God, but they didn't call him King of the Jews. It was one of the titles of Jesus that apparently the earliest followers of Jesus didn't latch onto. So we don't see it in the letters of Paul, and we don't see it elsewhere in the Gospels. So what scholars have said is, look, this thing, King of the Jews, doesn't look like a Christological confessional title that Christians made up and then put into the Gospel.
Okay, so you get the point there, right? I mean, this is secular historians, very skeptical. They are not Bible-believing Christians. Even they are backing me up in what I said about these criteria of authenticity and saying, yeah, we can absolutely prove that Jesus died by crucifixion on this basis. Okay, so one thing I just want to move into is a different explanation. So in terms of Jesus' death on the cross, sometimes Muslims will come in and they'll say, I've had Arif Khan on my show before, and they'll say, look, we believe that Jesus, he was put up on the cross. That's a historical fact. Yeah. But he didn't die on the cross. He merely swooned on the cross. You thought he was dead, but you were tricked. He swooned. So he passed out. He was put in the tomb and he revived over the few days. And then he emerged from the tomb somehow and convinced everyone that he rose from the dead. So this is called the swoon theory. And we have various responses to it. I'm going to play a video, just a quick 2-minute video to show you about the swoon theory here. And some of the rebuttals to it. So let's listen to that.
Christians rely on the claim that Jesus resurrected from death as convincing evidence for the truthfulness of Christianity. Skeptics, however, have tried to find alternative explanations to the resurrection in ways that rely on naturalistic factors to avoid any miraculous explanations and discredit the Christian claims. One of those alternative explanations is called the swoon theory. The swoon theory claims that Jesus didn't really die. He just fainted from exhaustion and loss of blood. Everyone mistakenly thought that he was dead, but he wasn't. After he resuscitated, the disciples thought that he was miraculously resurrected from death. Now that's an interesting theory, but it fails to explain many events documented in the New Testament about the story of the resurrection. For one, there was a Roman soldier who had to ensure that Jesus was dead before he took him down from the cross. In Roman law, a soldier would be punished by execution if he let a criminal escape. Therefore, the soldier pierced the side of Jesus with a spear in order to remove any doubt that Jesus was dead. The swoon theory also fails to explain how Jesus rolled the stone to get out of the tomb if he had just revived from a swoon. It is highly improbable that a being who had got half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill wanting medical treatment, who required bandaging, strengthening, and indulgence, and who still at least yielded to his sufferings, could have given to the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave. Such a resuscitation could only have weakened the impression which Jesus had made upon his disciples in life and in death, and could by no possibility have changed their sorrow into enthusiasm or elevated their reverence into worship.
Okay, so there's that video explaining the swoon theory. You got the message there and giving some very conclusive rebuttals against it, right? So in the first place, we know from the historical details in the Gospels, number one, the Roman soldiers, they would have been killed if they didn't ensure that someone under their charge had been dead when condemned to die on the cross. They knew how to tell the difference between life and death, people that were just swooning and people that were actually dead. You know, it was their job to certify the death of criminals under their charge on the pain of their own deaths. And don't forget, with the Romans, they pierced Jesus' side and then the blood and water came out, as the Gospel of John tells us. It's just medically impossible, or virtually impossible, that Jesus could have survived on that cross. And all modern day medical experts, for the most part, agree. 99% of medical experts agree about how Jesus would have died. Now, there's disagreement on how exactly Jesus died. I've had a couple experts, Dr. Joseph Bergeron and Dr. Tom McGovern, today on my show explaining how they think he died, and why they don't believe other theories. But no medical expert, it's universal that Jesus did in fact die on the cross from a medical perspective. Now, it's important to note Josephus does give us one exception here about one person who was taken down from the cross immediately with two other people and given the best medical care money could buy. His two companions still died, but one of these people managed to survive. And they say, see, there's proof for a swoon theory. But this does not apply to Jesus with the beatings and scourgings and treatments he got, the fact that he was on the cross for hours, and the fact that he got that spear wound through his heart, piercing it to the point where blood and water would stream out, and that sort of thing, from the fluid building up in his lungs and stuff like that between his heart sac there. So it's extremely improbable that Jesus could have swooned, if not impossible, according to modern medical knowledge and the details we know about how Jesus was treated when he was crucified. Finally, the third response that is really important, it says, look, let's just somehow pretend that Jesus managed to survive the cross. And he hobbles out, manages to roll his stone away and hobbles past everybody in Jerusalem and then makes it to his disciples. Says, ta-da, here I am, I rose from the dead. Are you nuts, skeptic? Do you seriously think that Jesus, they would proclaim him the risen Lord and in glory and all this stuff. No, they'd be saying, oh my gosh, get him a bed, get him some water. I'm going to run and get the doctor. He needs help. They would not proclaim him the risen Lord. That's just foolish. So yeah, the swoon theory has been utterly discredited by most rational people today. It's not a reasonable theory to hold, at least the natural version of it. Okay, so last thing here is the significance of Jesus' atoning death. So one thing to stress is that it's very interesting. For most of the apostles, it's just the fact that Jesus died for our sins. The fact that he died, that's all that matters. Paul is different in that he's the first one in human history and inspired scripture to stress not just that Jesus died, but the mode of how Jesus died. The fact that Jesus died on the cross through crucifixion, the most painful mode of execution that existed at that time, excruciating pain. That proves how much he loves us. And I've quoted a scholar on the Apostle Paul, Dr. Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who says, Peter must have been deeply touched by Paul's insatiable curiosity about Jesus. To this extent, they delighted in a common quest. But there was one important issue, however, on which they might have differed. The stress that Paul laid on the crucifixion of Jesus set him apart from other preachers among the first Christians. The others mentioned the death of Jesus and underlined its sacrificial dimension by saying that he died for our sins. They did not spell out exactly how he died or how it happened. Paul did. So that's an interesting perspective there. Jesus suffered hell for us. This is another important mention here, that the penalty for sin is not physical death, it's spiritual death, right? Physical death is just the byproduct of that. So Jesus experienced spiritual death on the cross for us. When he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was experiencing spiritual death, hell on earth for us. Because what is hell? It's the relational separation of God and man, right? Permanent, irreconcilable relational separation from God. And that's what Jesus did. He was experiencing relational separation from God the Father, and that's why he cries out. Finally, he achieved atonement. What does atonement mean? It means at one-ment in English, right? And basically, it's talking about reconciliation between God and man. Jesus' death allowed sinful human beings like me and you to reconcile with a holy and just God. And that's incredible. And there are various theories about, well, how does this work? And, how are we purified of our sins and cleansed so that we can reconcile with God? And that's the topic that I'm going to do next time before Easter, on looking at some of the theories of the atonement, how it works. How did Jesus' death atone for my sins in any way, and how that makes sense. So look out for that next time. That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed.